this is the Indivisible group. We call ourselves IReb. We're the Indivisible Resistance of Eagan and Burnsville. There's some folks that I don't think have been to any of our meetings before. We host community events like this, and tonight we're hosting an event with our Secretary of State, Steve Simon, and it's a town hall on voter rights, access, and security. And I'm going to kind of spoil the punchline here. Minnesota's in pretty good shape. We've got an excellent system here, and I'm going to turn it over to Steve Simon to give us a report on just where we are. But before I do that, I want to make sure that we do talk about how big our blue wave is going to be before you get done tonight. All right, that's Steve Simon.
All right. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. I know there's a lot going on, particularly tonight. There was a big fundraiser that I heard about that was going on in close proximity, so I really appreciate you being here, and some of you may be shuttled in between. So thank you for being here. We got 27 days. Yeah. 27 days until the election. It's going to be a big one. And I can tell you that people are fired up to vote. You may know that our office does a lot of stuff. We do business registrations and filings. We run a program called the Safe at Home program for victims of domestic violence and stalking and sexual assault. But most people, when or if they think of the Office of Secretary of State, they think about this stuff. They think about elections and our role as the Chief Elections Administrator. So I like to say that I'm in the democracy business, and business is booming. Let me just give you a few numbers. I don't want to just throw stats out at you all night, but I want to give you some to put in perspective what may just be about to happen in 27 days in terms of the outpouring of sort of popular participation. So we just released some numbers recently about, so far, voter participation in Minnesota. Let me know what you think of this. Minnesota right now, if you look at all the new voter registrations from January 1st to now, calendar year 2018, not including people who re-registered, not someone who moved from Eagan to St. Paul or St. Paul to Mankato, just the people who are brand new on the voter rolls. We are literally 2 to 1, double where we were 4 years ago at the same exact date, okay? 4 years ago I use as the best reference because it's an apples to apples comparison. It's the last midterm, the last non-presidential election year, right? Pretty good comparison. 2014 to now, to the exact date, we are 2 to 1. We have doubled that number, okay? And the other thing to know about that is 67% of that new number, 67% are voters between the ages of 18 to 30. How did that compare with 4 years ago? It's about 10 points higher as a proportion. Wow. So not only are the numbers, the raw numbers, way up, 2 to 1, but the percentage of those 2 to 1 raw numbers that are young people is quite a bit up as well. So that's good. You look at the number like voter registration, that's great. Here's another statistic to throw at you. If you look at the number of absentee ballots that have been ordered, just requested and mailed out, and the number that have already been returned, both of those figures, we are at 200% over where we were 4 years ago. So there's something going on out there. This isn't made up. This isn't someone's talking points or someone's spin. Something is going on out there. We won't know completely what it is until 27 days from now, but people sure seem primed and ready and fired up to vote. So you may know that Minnesota has a really, really good record when it comes overall, over the sweep of time, not just the here and now. You may know that we have a really good record when it comes to turnout and participation in Minnesota. You may not know how good it has been. At one point in our recent history, we were number 1 in the country for 9 elections in a row. Just think about that for a minute. Let that sink in. 9 in a row, number 1, Minnesota. If you heard a win streak like that, if you heard about a win streak like that in any other area, let's say you heard about an athlete who won 9 MVP awards in a row, or an actor or actress who won 9 Oscars in a row, you'd be floored, wouldn't you? 9 in a row? I mean, that's just superhuman. Minnesota, at one point, 9 in a row, number 1 in the country, until recently. A few years ago, we started to slip just a little bit, not a lot, nothing to lose too much sleep over. So when I came in 2014 into this job as Secretary of State, we were number 6 in the country. Not bad at all, right? If you're grading on a curve, 6 out of 50 is really, really good. You would bring that grade home to mom and dad, right? But not quite good enough. So when I got in 2014, I and my office challenged Minnesota and Minnesotans to get us back to number 1. And we knew that to do that effectively, we would have to talk to new people, new ways in new parts of the state. We knew we would have to do that, and we would have to enlist hundreds of partners, individuals, businesses, nonprofits, and others, in order to meet that goal. Of course, part of this is our office, part of it is on the campaigns and the candidates and others. It's a group effort, it's a team effort for sure. But here's the spoiler alert. 2016 election night, despite everything else that was going on, Minnesota came through and with flying colors, and we met our goal, we reached the top, and we are now, once again, number one in the country in voting, which is great, right? So, in case you're wondering what that is, it's about 74.7%, so just shy of 3/4. So in other words, of all the people in Minnesota who are 18 years old, residents of Minnesota, a citizen, and not currently serving a felony sentence, in other words, all eligible voters, you take that group, and just about 75% of them voted. That is an extraordinary number. It really is. We should be really proud of that. Any guesses as to who dead last was? We were first. Who was 50th?
Georgia.
Just blurt it out. Not Georgia.
Mississippi.
Poor Mississippi. They always get guessed. When I ask that question, Mississippi, invariably someone says Mississippi. It is not Mississippi. The answer is Hawaii.
Really?
Hawaii is number
Really?
50, and they are routinely towards the bottom of the list. Maybe not dead last, but I guess if you live in paradise, right? You have other things to do. I don't know. I'm sure people will write about that. Yeah. So Hawaii was dead last. We were number one, which is great. And I get asked quite often, why? Why Minnesota? Why do we deserve this honor? What have we done to have numbers like this? What is it about us? Is it dumb luck? Is it something in the water? Is it sheer coincidence? No, I don't think it's any of those things. I have a theory, one person's theory. I think it's primarily three things. The first one is laws. We've got really good laws on the books in Minnesota, put there over time, mostly in a bipartisan way over the last few decades, to reward and encourage voting. I mean, these laws really err on the side of access. We're in the middle of baseball playoffs, or towards the beginning of baseball playoffs, so permit me a baseball analogy. You know that the rule, a basic rule in baseball, is the tie goes to the runner, right? If the throw gets to the base, right as the base runner is stepping on the base, the tie goes to the runner. In Minnesota, the rule has more often than not been the tie goes to the voter. What I mean by that is when legislators, and I used to be one for 10 years, when legislators are weighing competing values about election-related laws, they tend to decide on what's easiest for the everyday voter, not other values. And there are others who have other values, but it's about access. And that's what I'm all about. I've said very often, my mission in this office is very simple, very clear, not at all complicated. You could fit it on a bumper sticker. My mission in this office is to make it as easy as possible for all eligible voters to vote, period. That's it. Yeah, that's it. Not hard to understand at all, but yet a lot of people really disagree with that. They think the emphasis should be elsewhere, the priority should be elsewhere. I disagree. I think part of what makes us special in Minnesota and successful is that over time we have erred on the side of access. And that is very, very important. So what do I mean by that when I talk about access and the laws? Well, a few things. First, you probably know, we have same-day voter registration in Minnesota, or election day voter registration. Huge, huge. We adopted it in 1974 for the first time. It's been 44 years, and we're still one of the only states that has it. We're one of like 14 states that have it. And you know, if you've lived in another state, or you know people who have, that in most other states, if you aren't registered to vote by mid-October or early October, you are out of luck. That's it. There is no second chance. There is no exception for forgetting, or you were ignorant of the law, or you didn't realize that moving from Rosemont to Minneapolis meant you had to re-register. Too bad. You're done. Yesterday, in fact, marked the registration deadline for something like 10 or a dozen states.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. They are done. Today is too late. Tomorrow's really late. Done. In Minnesota, not so. In Minnesota, as you know, you can roll out of bed that day, stroll right on down to your polling place, and you can register and you can vote. And that, probably more than anything, in my opinion, has moved the needle in the last 4 decades or so. Really, it's tremendous. We also have online voter registration, a great convenience. It means, of course, that you don't have to put pen to paper anymore. If you don't want, you can. You don't have to go to a government office anymore or sign someone's clipboard on a street corner, although you can do all of those things. That's perfectly valid. But you can just go to a website. It's our website, mnvotes.org, mnvotes.org, and you can register online. Very easy. For most people, it takes you 3 minutes, sometimes 2. And then the final one I just want to highlight, there are others, but this last one I have some special pride of ownership in because during my last term in the legislature, this was my bill. And that is, now here's the clunky title. The long and clunky and technical title is No Excuses Absentee Voting. But I like to just call it Vote from Home. So you may remember that before we passed this bill, which I call the old days, in the old days, the rule to vote absentee in Minnesota was you had to be absent. That's where it got its name, absentee ballot. You got to be absent. And you had to prove it. You had to sign an oath under penalty of perjury, swearing and promising that you were going to be out of town that day or that you were too sick or disabled to actually go to a polling place. Well, we kind of looked at each other in the legislature and we said, what are we doing here? Why do we care if someone wants to vote the day before or the week before or even the month before? As long as there's some reasonable guidelines in place, why do we care about someone signing a blood oath, pledging and promising all these things? So we got rid of the excuse. And now none of us who want to vote before Election Day within a certain period, we don't need an excuse. We don't need an explanation. There's not even a space to put one. You just do it because you want to do it. And Minnesotans have really, really flocked to this. They love it. It is not going away. Another statistic. Before we pass this bill, the typical percentage of Minnesotans who would vote absentee was about 8%, maybe 9% or a little higher in a stretch year, okay? You know what it was in 2016, just 2 years ago? Almost 23%. So we're marching on a quarter of voters who are voting before Election Day even comes around. Think about all the long-term sort of downstream effects there. It's probably going to affect politics and campaigns. I mean, that last-minute hit piece that the campaign might want to put out the weekend before where their opponent can't respond, well, if you're only hitting 70% of voters because 30% have already voted, maybe that's not quite the great investment you thought it was if you're that campaign manager in that campaign. So those are just some of the things I'm speculating that might happen down the road. So I always use the example of my dad. My dad is 84 years old, soon to be 85. He's got Parkinson's disease. He doesn't drive a car. He uses a walker. And in 2014, the first year that this was offered, he used this. He had the ballot come to him. There are two ways to vote by absentee, of course. One is to just physically go into a city hall or a county office. But the better way, in my opinion, is just have the ballot come to you. Order it to you, and then you can take your time. My dad loved it. He loved the freedom and flexibility of it. He even claims that he voted for me. I'll never know, right? Secret ballot. Plus, he kind of talks a big game anyway. But the point is, it's not just for 84-year-old guys with Parkinson's disease. It's for every one of us who just might want to vote early. We have a long absentee period, tied for the longest in the country with South Dakota at 46 days. That means September 21st was the first day that you could vote in this election. So we and South Dakota literally kicked off voting for the whole country. We're the first jurisdiction. We have the longest or the earliest absentee ballot period, and we're in it right now as I'm standing here. We are right in the middle of it. So any one of us can go to mnvotes.org, order the ballot to come to you, and the great part is, again, like my dad in 2014 and many others since then, you can vote one contest while you're eating breakfast, put it down, put it away for an hour or a day or a week, pick it up again when you're folding laundry, put it down again, do a little research, go on Google, whatever, pick it up again, and so on and so on. So people really love it. So that's what I mean by laws. I mean, we've got good laws on the books. Now, they're always under threat. They're always under attack, believe me, both when I was in the legislature and now in this office of Secretary of State. I see it every year. There are proposals and sometimes committee hearings and sometimes some scary votes on provisions that would weaken or water down or whittle away the protections that we have. There's no question. It's unrelenting. And so every legislative session, we have to do the same thing, shoring up the gains that we've made and making sure we don't lose ground. But it's a nice place to be in the sense that we're in a good spot in terms of what we have on the books. We could do a lot of things differently and better. I'd like to see even more laws that afford even more access. I'd like to see automatic voter registration in Minnesota. I'd like to see pre-registration for high school students, ages 16 and 17. I'd like to see us restore the right to vote to people who have left prison behind. That is very important. Yep. And by the way, that is the trend nationwide. More and more states are moving in that direction. States like North Dakota, that's probably the closest state to us that has that same system. So we're going to get there. It has broad bipartisan support. Liberal Democrats, conservative Republicans, we're not quite there yet, but I think we're going to get there. So that's laws. I mentioned that I thought there were 3 reasons that account for our success when it comes to voting. 1 is laws. 2, I think, is culture. Now that's, I know, can be a loaded term. People use culture They weaponize that word for political purposes. Here's what I mean in this context. I mean a habit or a way of doing things. Our habit, our way of doing things in Minnesota has been to vote and to value elections. We aren't sort of taught here, whether it's in schools or just from our civic culture, that elections are a joke or a charade. To the contrary, I think we're taught that they matter. They're consequential, they're significant. People get elected to stuff, whether it's city council or president of the United States or anything else, and what they do once they get in office or fail to do, that has real world consequences for all of us. And people seem to get that here. And let me just tell you a quick kind of detour, historical detour, that kind of struck me early on when I got into this job. So right when I came in 2015, we were preparing a statewide celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, passed in 1965. Big deal, right? I mean, I think most historians would say it's on their top 10 list of major pieces of legislation that Congress has ever passed since, the dawn of the country. 1965. And of course, the Voting Rights Act said to states that had restrictive voting policies, you can no longer have poll taxes. You can no longer have so-called literacy tests to vote. You can't have so-called character tests to vote. And there were a whole, host of really discriminatory, outrageous, really, policies in some parts of this country. The Voting Rights Act sought to get rid of that. That's a no-brainer now. The vote in this room would be 100% to 0, but in 1965 it was considered controversial. Now, here's the Minnesota angle. Add on to that the fact that our congressional delegation in 1965, just like now, we sent 8 members to the U.S. House, same as we have now. It was 4 and 4. 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, evenly divided, and these 8 people were at each other's throats on issues like the escalating involvement in Vietnam, the proposed new Medicare and Medicaid programs, immigration, federal spending, you name it, on and on and on. Tumultuous time. But in the summer of 1965, when they called the roll on the Voting Rights Act, Minnesota spoke with one voice, and we were one of the few states that was unanimous. All 8 members of the U.S. House from Minnesota, all the Democrats, all the Republicans, suburban, urban, rural, didn't matter. All of them voted yes. Now, the lesson I draw from that is not that Democrats and Republicans are always going to get along on elections issues. No, that's not the lesson I draw, because I've seen that close up, and that doesn't always happen. There's disagreement, and that's okay. But the lesson I do draw is that on the big moral questions, who is in and who is out? Who gets to participate and who is shut out? We have tended to agree more than we have disagreed over the sweep of time, and I hope we can get back closer to that before. So the culture is something that's important. We tried in 2016 to have our own effect on the culture in a way. As I mentioned, we knew we had to reach out in an aggressive way, in an innovative way, and we did that. So we targeted several groups where we knew we had room to grow and room to improve. One of them was our youngest voters. It's one of the reasons I'm so psyched to hear about these and to report out these numbers that we're seeing with a larger and larger percentage of young people among the newly registered in Minnesota this year. So we knew, no big shocker, no big surprise, in Minnesota, like everywhere else I know of in this country, young people vote at far lower rates than the rest of us. That's just a fact. We don't have to accept it as a fact, but it is a fact. We don't have to just sit there and sort of be resigned to it forever. So we thought, all right, what can we do that is new, that is unusual? That might actually make a difference. So we did a couple things. We started something in colleges that we called Minnesota Ballot Bowl, which is simply a competition among college campuses to register students to vote. We got 68 colleges and universities, 2-year, 4-year, public, private, and it was great. It was a big success, and it spurred a lot of enthusiasm and activity on campus. We're doing it again this year. But then we thought, well, why stop with colleges? Let's get going even younger and get good habits started early in high schools. So we started something that had never been done in Minnesota. We just made it up. The first ever statewide mock election for high school students. Now, there are individual high schools that might have that in their social studies class, but they were never sort of knit together. So the idea of the program was, okay, we know that we got to get good habits started early. We know that if young people think of themselves as voters before they even are voters, they're probably going to vote that first time, 18, 19, 20, whatever. And if they do that, vote that first time, they're probably going to make it a lifelong habit. We know that, all the data says that, and whatever. So the way we structured it was, let's keep it real simple, keep it to one contest, President of the United States then, Governor this year, that's it, not everything, just one. We'll print up for free and provide for free all the ballots. We will provide the I voted stickers. The kids love the I voted stickers. The posters. We all love them, right? The promotional materials, all that stuff. So we did that, and we told schools, hey, you run it the way that you want. We're not going to boss you around. If you want to do it in social studies classes, great. If you want to do it in the cafeteria, great. Have fun. We're not going to micromanage you. Report the results to us, and then we'll report them out centrally on our website with charts and maps and graphs and all the rest, so that kids in Rosemount could see how kids in Mankato or Duluth or anywhere else voted. So we just started this thing, and we thought, all right, it's never been done. Some schools might be like, I don't know, what is this? So let's shoot for a goal of 100 high schools, right? It seemed like a nice round number. It's triple digits. It's memorable. 100 schools. That was our goal. Let's the march to get 100 schools to sign up for this. We didn't get 100. We got 281 high schools, 96,000 students. This year, we have more schools and 130,000 students.
Wow.
It's a lot of ballots we're printing. But, so we're really psyched about that. We even tried to have an impact, speaking of culture, on the way that we talk about voting to young people in particular, really everybody, but young people in particular. And in 2015, when I first came in, and our team first came in, we saw that there was some chatter and discussion and some writing on the subject of even just little things, like the language that you use when you talk about voting, particularly young people, but really everyone. And there were these studies that showed, honest to God, that if you talk about voting not only as an act, not only about doing something, but being something. So not just, please vote, you should vote, go vote, but be a voter. If you say that, it can actually have an impact, particularly on young people, but really everyone. I was a skeptic at first, but we did that, and we started integrating that language in the way that we talk about it. And I remember at the time when we were putting these plans together, I talked to a friend of mine about this, and I was explaining this to him, and all of a sudden he breaks out in this wide grin, and he says, I just had kind of a light bulb moment. I said, what's that? He said, well, I've got a teenage daughter at home. From now on, I'm gonna tell her, be a laundry folder. No word on whether that has worked. You can try that at home, by the way, with kids, parents, anyone, siblings. But that's what I mean by culture, just changing those little things about voting. And we think it can have a real impact. And so that's really the second reason I would say is culture. I mentioned that I thought there were three. The third reason I think that Minnesota does really well has to do with confidence. People in the state have confidence overall in the election system. That's not to say that there aren't areas that we can change or should change, whether it's the laws, whether it's the way we do things, whatever. And those come from the left, the right, all points in between, of course. But people know that it's fundamentally an honest system. They do. They know that that the work is done in a very decentralized way. So in our office, we don't count a single vote, not one. We don't own a single piece of elections equipment, not one. Instead, that's farmed out. That is done in counties and cities all over the state. 4,100 precincts, 32,000 election judges to run an election. Anyone here been an election judge ever? Oh man, thank you. That's my sort of lifetime resolution is if I meet a past or present election judge to thank them, to thank you. I really appreciate it. It takes 32,000 election judges to put on an election. 32,000. That's a small army. And I bet you didn't do that for your health or to get rich, right? It's a long day. Yes, you get a stipend, and you'll probably be pretty well fed because everyone brings snacks and crock pots and all the rest. But other than that, you're doing it for a different reason. So, but people understand, they just seem to, that this is an apolitical process. It's not, it's done with a lot of integrity. It's done in an honest way, in an apolitical way, in a decentralized way. And it just stands to reason, right? I mean, I don't think people would show up time after time in such high numbers if they thought it was just a corrupt cesspool. Would you? I wouldn't. What a waste of time. If you thought it was just a totally rigged system and that a bunch of political hacks of whatever party were just going to put their thumb on the scale and then election judges were on the take or something like that, why would you even bother? I would not at all. But people do, and that's because they understand that fundamentally there's a reason for the confidence that they have. However, there are threats to that confidence, and I want to outline just a couple quickly in keeping with what you said in the introduction. So there are threats to that confidence in Minnesota and nationwide. One of them, I have to say, it has to do with a narrative that President Trump, among others, has spread, unfortunately. And that has to do with his claim, starting in December of 2016, before he was actually sworn in, his claim, if you recall, that 3 to 5 million people in this country had voted illegally, fraudulently. 3 to 5 million. That's what he said. Now, does that bear any relation to the fact that he lost the popular vote by about 3 million? Who's to say? Who's to say? But he said 3 to 5 million. Now, let's say, just for the sake of argument, that you believe that once in a while he exaggerates. Okay? So let's throw out the 5 million number. Let's just throw it out and pretend he never said it and just focus on 3 million. The low end of what he says was the scale. 3 to 5 million, forget 5. Let's say 3. Let's just assume 3 just for a second. At 3 million people nationwide having voted illegally, fraudulently, having committed a felony, let's call it what it is. This is not a parking ticket. This is a serious crime. Minnesota's share of that, based on population, would be north of 50,000 people. 50,000 new felons. We don't even have 20,000 prison beds in this state, okay? So basically what he's saying is the number was so astronomically, cartoonishly high that we would have to triple the number of prisons in Minnesota to house all these new felons. It is an absurd claim on its face. It's even more absurd when you look into the details and understand how incomprehensibly, ridiculous it is. I mean, it's a fantasy. And nothing like that has ever happened in Minnesota. It's not happening now, nor will it ever happen. The incidence of wrongdoing at the polling place in Minnesota is very, very small. It's very isolated. It's very contained. So under Minnesota law, all of our county attorneys or prosecutors, they have to report to our office within 10 days of closing an investigation, let alone a decision about whether to charge someone, let alone that person getting convicted. We're talking about just someone gives them a tip, a hunch, a bad vibe, whatever. They look into it. They close the investigation. Within 10 days of that happening, they have to report to our office. So we get all the data from the ground up. We don't just get conviction data. We get everything from the beginning to the end. The last time I checked the list, keep in mind, we set a record. In 2016, we had nearly 3 million voters in Minnesota, just shy of 3 million. We had 11 convictions, 11. Now, that's 11 too many. All of us in this room wish that that number was 0. I do, every one of you in this room does, of course. But let's put that in a little bit of perspective, right? 11 out of almost 3 million. If I told you that your rate of error in what you choose to do, I don't care whether it's a job, a hobby, a sport, whatever, and I said your rate of error is gonna be that. 11, the fraction is 11 over just about 3 million. 7/10,000ths of 1%. You'd say, sign me up. That's near perfection. And yet, despite that very small and isolated number of misconduct, you see this narrative, starting with the president, unfortunately, about widespread voter fraud. And I can't speak for any other state, but I can tell you in Minnesota that's just not true. And unfortunately, that narrative has been used over the years to justify attempts to do really bad things to our very special and effective voting laws in the state. And we can't let that happen. So that's one of the threats to the confidence. Another one that I just want to highlight for you, because it's ripped from the headlines, literally, has to do with cybersecurity. You've seen the headlines starting 2 years ago about potential vulnerabilities. And I have to tell you, in my opinion, the #1 threat to the integrity of our election system in this state and in this country is the danger of some sort of attack, cyber attack, by outside entities who want to do us harm, who want to undermine and disrupt our democracy. Minnesota in 2016 was one of the 21 states that was targeted by a foreign government. We know that. That's not a he said, she said. That's not subject to interpretation or debate. That happened. And don't take my word for it. I've been in the briefings from Department of Homeland Security, the Director of National Intelligence, FBI counterterrorism, and others who meet with secretaries of state to tell us this. So Minnesota was on that list. We were one of the 21 states. So what happened? Well, here's the analogy I've settled on with the blessing of Homeland Security. Picture a car thief casing a parking lot. Maybe he comes there a couple days in a row. Maybe he brings binoculars or listening devices. He's observing traffic patterns. He wants to get in, but he wants to do his homework and figure out what the best way in. He's plotting, he's scheming, he wants to get in. What the Department of Homeland Security and federal intelligence officials have told us is that we had car thieves casing our parking lot. They know who they are, they know who they were working for, and they know the purpose for which they were trying to get in. For whatever reason, they didn't go in. We think it's at least in part because of some of the cybersecurity features that we put up over the preceding year and a half or so. But the point is that they didn't go in. So we were one of the fortunate states in that way. But 2 out of those 21 states were not so fortunate. 2 of those 21 states They did have a breach, and it was a serious breach. I would say, to extend the analogy, they didn't just get into the parking lot, they got into the car, and in the case of one state, Illinois, I would say that they started the engine. 60 Minutes, the news program, did a report on exactly what happened in Illinois last March. I think they re-aired it this summer. It's pretty scary stuff. And so the federal government, I have to say, has been pretty helpful after a rocky start to us, Homeland Security and others, giving us a lot of resources, making sure that we get classified intelligence briefings. They've asked all secretaries of state, plus 2 others in each office, to get a security clearance, which I have and we have, so we can get these kinds of briefings. But it's a big deal. And I get asked all the time, whether it's people I run into on the street who I know, or people at a family gathering, they'll say, hey, you've been in the office now 3+ years, what's your biggest surprise as Secretary of State? And I always say my biggest surprise is exactly this. My biggest surprise in this job has been the extent to which my time and focus and energy has been on this, election security and cybersecurity in particular. It's not something even 4 years ago that I was asked a lot about at any candidate forum, editorial board meeting, group screening, anything like that. But 2016 was a real watershed moment for sure. And now it is a major part of the job. So the good news is that Minnesota is in pretty good shape, at least in one sense. And that is that the structure of our system is pretty sound, starting with the fact that we're a paper ballot state, right? We aren't like these other states. Yeah, right. Seriously. You can clap on that. There are many states in this country, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Louisiana, Virginia, those are some of the ones that come to mind, and a long list, that have touchscreen voting machines with no paper trail, no receipt. South Carolina, right. You go take cash out of an ATM, you expect better from that. At least you get a receipt, something you can touch and feel and save if you want. No, not in those other states. In Minnesota, we got good old-fashioned low-tech paper, right? It's one of those examples where low-tech beats high-tech, hard-to-hack paper. And yes, it's true that you hand that paper ballot to an election judge, who then feeds it into a machine, but
You feed it in.
It can go either way in polls, but it can in some places.
Okay.
But
We're not supposed to touch it as an election judge.
in some cases you can, like if someone has a disability
Yeah,
and other things like
yes.
that. So, but anyway, it is fed into a machine by someone, either the voter or someone else. And but under state law, that machine cannot, during any part of the election day, be connected to the internet. We have an encrypted system by which those numbers are transmitted to our office, and then there's a whole bunch of back-end stuff. There are post-election audits, post-election reviews, and under federal law, we get to keep the ballots for almost 2 years. So anyone can touch and feel and see, and there's a verifiable paper trail always, and that's not gonna go away. There is bipartisan lockstep agreement with that. So that puts us in a really good place. So I'm not as worried about something happening in the polling place. My bigger worry is that something will happen into the centralized functions that our office runs. We run something called the Statewide Voter Registration System, SVRS. It's a multi-million-dollar database. It was built with federal money in 2004. But like a lot of things built and built well in 2004, it isn't quite state-of-the-art anymore. Remember that flip phone you loved in 2004? You might not want it now. Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't, but you'd maybe be taking some risks. So we need to redo that, and that's the part that gives me pause. That makes me realize that we have to spend time, effort, and yes, resources in order to upgrade and modernize our system. So we have a good thing going, and generally we do in Minnesota as well. And with 27 days left, I think it's a time to reflect on all that. That's good. But let's face it, and I just want to end here and then get to your questions or comments. We can pass all the laws we want. We can have as great a voting culture as we want. We can have a high degree of confidence if you take a poll. But we all know people. I know I do. And a couple of you have already talked to me about people in your life that you know who don't vote. And they don't vote. The reason they don't vote has nothing to do with the fact that they don't know what the rules are, what the law is, or where they could find those rules or laws. They don't vote because they're disillusioned or disgusted by politics, by politicians, by campaigns, by the way all of this is done, by electioneering generally, by what is being discussed, by what isn't being discussed. There is that out there, there's no question. And that is a tough nut to crack. If it were easy, it would have been done a long time ago. So that is tough, and we all know people like that. And we also know that some of those people, they almost want to stay away from the polls as sort of a way to protest. They're striking a blow for a cause. They think that if they stay away from the polls, they're actually making themselves felt and heard in a different kind of way, right? We've all felt that. I have even felt it, even though I'm an elected official. I've felt that, of course, even fleetingly for a second, like, wake me when it's over, let's just get past this. But I think the key thing, as you all know, is not to give in to that impulse. It's a natural impulse to have. Don't give into it. I can't put it any better than the words I once saw on a t-shirt. It was at a parade. And the t-shirt said, failure to vote is not an act of rebellion, it's an act of surrender. I like that. I like it a lot, especially when I talk to young people. Younger, I mean, than all of you. And I say, I talk about that t-shirt and about how, look, you turn 18 in this country, you get a lot of things. Hopefully, a slice of birthday cake, a pat on the back, a present or two, and you know what else you get? Formal political power. Formal political power. Use it. Don't leave it on the table. Don't give it up. Don't surrender it. Go out there and do it. And if that means you vote for only half the contests on the ballot, great. If that means you write in a couple people because you don't like the offerings on the ballot for a particular contest, that's great. That's still voting. Just go out there and make sure your voice is heard. So, we got 27 days. I hope that our rallying cry will be to everyone we know and meet to stand up, to step up, and to be voters. Thanks. Now, I would love, if we got time, to hear some of not only your questions, but answers. Pushback, feedback. My tender feelings will not be hurt by criticism either. So let me know what's on your mind. Go ahead.
I got three. You don't got to take them all at once. If somebody else
That's all right. Go ahead.
We'll spread it around. But the first question I have is, in 2012 we had the voter ID amendment. Is there anything we can do? You talked about like the risk of losing these laws, kind of enshrine them. Like, so instead of attacking them through the Constitution, enshrine them through the Constitution. So we have a line of defense if there's some laws that are passed that jeopardize those.
Yes, interesting. So many of you remember that 6 years ago we had the big statewide conversation and debate about government issued photo ID. There was a constitutional amendment on the ballot. I was part of the Vote No campaign, and thankfully the voters in Minnesota spoke and pretty clearly rejected that. But your question seems to be, what if instead of playing constitutional defense, we play constitutional offense and actually put in the Constitution not stuff to weaken and water down, but stuff to strengthen?
Yeah.
Maybe put some of these protections that I mentioned or others that you might have in mind and put them in the Constitution. It's certainly possible. I will say there's a certain weariness after that battle of having big constitutional fights where you don't have to. In other words, if you can keep stuff at the level of regular old laws and statutes, which after all can be amended and tweaked and changed from time to time based on the legislators. You put something in the Constitution, you're kind of writing in permanent ink. The only way you can change something in the Constitution is through another constitutional amendment, and that's just a big upheaval. So I think it's less likely than likely that would happen, but we'll see. I mean, it's always possible that kind of thing becomes necessary if enough of these assaults on our voting rights get too far. I guess that's the best way I can put it. You had something else?
Yeah. So I've given a lot of thought to this because in my mind it's the biggest issue in our country right now. If we when we look at Georgia and the voter list purges and stuff like that, it's happening across the country. And I'm glad that I don't hear a lot of that stuff happening here, and I thank you for that. But I wonder about we have a paper trail, and if our system were hacked and there's a percentage cutoff at which we don't do a manual recount, somebody hacks that and can change the numbers. Why wouldn't they just put it right outside that window so that we don't do the manual recount? And you hear about this not only in Minnesota but all over the place. We're having these incredibly tight, incredibly close elections. So what I've wondered is, what is the cost and what is the feasibility of implementing something like mandatory manual recounts? Just across the board, we've got paper, we check the paper.
Mm-hmm. So what is the cost? So I'll just repeat the question for the benefit of those. If this audio didn't pick up the audio. So the question is, should we have mandatory manual recounts basically in all contests, pretty much in all contests,
Yeah.
right? So the threshold right now for statewide elections is the only mandatory, and even then it isn't totally mandatory, but the only recount where the government will pay for it. A political campaign doesn't have to pay for it. On a statewide election, if it's within 1/4%. If the margin is beyond that, then to have a recount, some political party or campaign would have to pay for it. I mean, technically, you could be down 1 million votes, and if you wanna pay for it, you could have a recount, but it's not something that the government will pay for. And that system seems to have served us well. I think we could move around the threshold, as you correctly suggest, to make it either tighter or looser or whatever. Maybe it depends on whether it's statewide or congressional or legislative, and we've done those over the years. The legislature has, even before my time, like kind of recalibrated that every so often. You ask about the cost. It would be costly for sure. I mean, even one recount in one contest statewide is really costly. It can be millions of dollars. So to do it for every contest up and down, like a true manual recount, is tough. But one of the reasons I like the fact that we have this paper trail is if someone does have a hunch or a bad vibe or a bad feeling or gets a tip about a particular contest, large or small, you can get a recount done. You may have to pay for it and find the money to pay for it, that's true. But if that's been a problem, then we can just adjust that threshold, so that maybe it's no longer 1/4%, it can be some other number or whatever. But it would be a real expense in just pure dollars to do every contest across the board. But with a paper trail, we at least have it so that if we wanted to make adjustments of the kind that you're talking about, we could do that, and we always have the paper, period. That's great. You had a third one?
Follow-on
Okay.
question of that.
Yeah.
So, what audit steps do we have in place right now currently? Because it's not just once and through, I think there is an audit.
There is.
A reconciliation.
There is. Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, there's a reconciliation in every one of the 4,100 polling places in the state. As you know, you're nodding vigorously, you know that election judges will sometimes stay well into the night if they can't get the numbers to match. They will not report the results until they say, well, let's see, at this polling place, we had 1,281 ballots go in the machine. How come it's off by 2? And in fact, there was some of that in Dakota County in 2016. There were some delayed election results for a couple of reasons in Dakota County. Yeah, well, one of those had to do with the software glitch at the county, but there were some very conscientious election judges, like all of you in the room who have done that, who said, no, we're not gonna report this number, let's count it again. Oh, it's not reporting it, let's count it a third time, let's count it a fourth time. And then they finally figure out, okay, these two stuck together, or something around. So that's number one. But in terms of post-election, so all the counties in the state, all 87 counties, have to do what's called a post-election audit, and this is set out in statute. There's a statistical threshold, and that can be changed as well over time if we think that we need to change. So they do that, and then our office, on top of all that, does something called a post-election review, where we go to all 8 congressional districts and sample. We don't go to every precinct, but we sample precincts randomly and do the actual hand count in those precincts. So it's statistically, if you talk to the statisticians, it isn't everyone, but just like opinion polls, don't ask everyone who you're gonna vote for. There's some statistical, and I don't pretend to be an expert on that, the threshold where they say, okay, this is highly, highly accurate. But it's always subject to change. So if we wanna say we wanna up the number of sampled ballots by some percentage, we should do that, as long as it has statistical support. But I feel good about the layers that we have. It's polling night, or election night at the polling place, it's post-election audits by the counties, and it's post-election review by our office. And then, even after that, anybody who can pony up the filing fee and wants to sue and say, well, we're challenging this, you can do that too. So there's always judicial review of all that stuff too. Yeah.
So on the precinct recounts, whatever you said, the audits,
Yeah.
does that ever get back to the election judges? As I was an election judge for 10 years, I know we were audited.
I see.
know.
After the fact, you mean?
Yeah, but I don't know
that's a
if
good
the
question.
feedback ever got back to the polling place people. Here's what we found, something, whatever it is, so
Yeah.
here's something to watch for next time.
I have never been asked that question, and it's a really good one. Like, if you worked on precinct 3 in a particular place, and then that was one of the random ones drawn out of a hat, wouldn't you wanna know as an election judge,
Yeah.
if they found some discrepancy, wouldn't you wanna know? I don't know an absolute answer to that. I would imagine that counties, cause it's a county-based kind of system when it comes to hiring the election judges, and it's county and city, I would imagine they might tell people, but I don't know of any provision that would say that you,
Yeah.
an election judge, would have to be notified,
Yeah.
anything like that. I would
just think
hope
it
that
would
they
be a
would.
good sort of wraparound for the election judges training.
Right.
Is to say, okay, this happened and we had an audit, here was the result, and
Right.
here's something to watch for.
That is a great
Maybe
insight.
talk about the next training, you know,
Yeah.
the next time, which is
Right.
Yeah,
2 years
exactly.
later,
Yeah, they
you
can-
know,
Make it a
they can
teachable
cover
moment,
that.
right.
Right.
Cover it at that point, yeah.
Go ahead.
You can let her go.
Oh, go ahead.
I actually have two questions. What exactly are the laws in Minnesota regarding criminal convictions voting?
Yes.
And two is, I'm not sure if you know this, would you be able to compare Minnesota to Wisconsin? My understanding is they used to have like a bipartisan commission
Yeah.
that did like district drawing and stuff that got Xed by the
Yes.
Republicans, but if you could just speak on
Let
that.
me answer the second question first, yes. So, years ago, like a lot of years ago, the Wisconsin Secretary of State was sort of stripped of most elections powers. And for a long time, they had, as you suggest, an independent board. It was a bipartisan independent board. I forget whether they called it an elections board or something like that. And legislative leaders in Wisconsin basically dismantled that board. And now it's a legislatively appointed by the majority, or the majority of members are appointed by the majority, who run the statewide elections or oversee them. I think it's still county-based there as well. I'm certainly not an expert, but that's what I know. So what's our status in Minnesota when it comes to people serving a felony sentence? So here's how I'd like to think of it. There are a few baskets. So over on this end of the spectrum, there are 2 states, Maine and Vermont only, just Maine and Vermont, where you never lose your right to vote. You could be in prison for a 700-year sentence. You're a serial axe murderer or something like that, and you always can vote if you want to. That's just those 2 states. The next group of states on the continuum are states which include North Dakota, closest to us. And in North Dakota, they say, and these other states, and it's a growing list of states, they say, look, when you're in prison for a felony, you can't vote. The minute you step out, you can vote, even if you're still serving part of your sentence on paper, as they call it, doing supervised release or probation or something else, you can vote. Minnesota is in the next group, which says you only get your right to vote back if you're a felon. You only get your right to vote back if or after you serve your entire sentence, both the prison part and the on-paper part. And then finally, over on this end of the spectrum, there are, I want to say, 8, 9, 10 states, largely in the Deep South, but not only, where you either actually or practically speaking never get your right back to vote, because it requires like a gubernatorial action, sort of almost the equivalent of a pardon or something. It's highly controversial, it's case by case, that kind of thing. So there's a movement to move Minnesota from its current category to the North Dakota category, which I support, which would say that the minute you step out of prison, you get your right to vote back. You left prison behind. I support that. You know, someone somewhere has made a determination that that person is safe enough, responsible enough, worthy enough to be among us. And to say that that person isn't really invested in the community anymore, we want such people not to reoffend, right? We want them to feel invested, to be part of our state and our community and our country, and it makes sense. So we have between 50 and 60,000 people in Minnesota who fall into that category. So there is a movement, and as I mentioned, it has bipartisan support. There are liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans, sometimes for different reasons, who think that's a good idea and we should move in that direction. I agree. I think we're gonna get there sooner rather than later. I can't say next year for sure. We'll see who the bodies are in the chairs, but I think we're moving in that direction. Yeah.
I got 2 questions now, based on hers. You say that Maine and Vermont allow you, even if you got a 700, do
Yeah.
they actually, can they vote in prison?
Yes, they can vote in prison.
Okay.
Yes.
So my other question is that I've seen things online that say that a lot of the counting machines, that there's only a limited number of companies that make them, and they all consider them proprietary, and they refuse to allow people like secretaries of states to ever audit them or check them out or do anything with them to ensure that they are legit and that they haven't been tampered or whatever. Is there any movement on that that you can think of that, you know, would be, that your office would be able to audit them?
Well, we have a very strong system in that regard in Minnesota. In other states, they don't have what we have. We have a 2-tiered system in Minnesota. So our office is in charge of certifying all elections equipment. You wanna sell a piece of elections equipment in the state, you have to go through our testing process. And we won't even look at it unless it has first been certified at the federal level. It's a voluntary certification at the federal level. Then and only then are they eligible to even have us look at it. Once we look at it, and I've been to this process, the public's always invited, Not many people take us up on it, but we always notice it. People can walk in, they can check it out. We put these machines through the paces. We look under the hood. We do all the technical testing of it. And if they wanna alter it even a little bit, they gotta recertify that piece of equipment. So we have a very strong, and have had for quite some time, testing and inspection and auditing kind of mechanism in Minnesota. So I feel very good about the equipment that we have. We only have, and we're pretty picky, we only have 3 vendors, 3 companies that are entitled to legally sell elections-related equipment of any kind in the state, 3 and 3 only. We're happy to do 4 or 5 if they meet our standards, but so far only 3 have.
Good, thank you.
Yep, go ahead.
I have a couple of numbers questions for you. So 75% of registered voters voted in 2016. What was the percentage of adults who could have voted
Oh.
but didn't necessarily register?
No, that is 75%.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
75%.
it's not 75% of registered, it's 75% of eligible voters voted, which is the better number. So
Yes.
it's not just of all those who registered, what percentage showed up. It's of all those who possibly could, are even eligible to vote. Of all the Minnesotans who are 18, residents, citizens, and not currently serving a felony sentence.
So that's even more impressive.
That's even more impressive,
Okay.
yes.
So
Yes.
the next question is, what's the drop-off between presidential years
Yeah.
and midterms?
Yeah, it can be pretty substantial. So we were at just shy of 75%, as I said, in 2016. In 2014, we were only a point or two above 50%.
Wow.
So, that's a pretty big drop-off.
Mhm.
Quarter.
It's a pretty big drop-off, 20-plus points.
Based on early votes now, do you think that number will?
I do.
High?
I'm reluctant to give an actual prediction, an actual figure, but I would say that I think it's gonna be higher. I think we're gonna have high turnout.
So it'll be
especially-
somewhere between 2014 and 16.
Yes.
I'll just
Yes.
toss out that I was on 538 the other day, and they were talking somewhere in the neighborhood of 62-63%.
For Minnesota?
Yeah.
That would be extraordinary.
That'd be great.
That would be really great. Huge. Yes.
There are a couple organizations and probably more like Clean Elections and Common Cause that are involved in voting issues. I don't wanna use the word collaborate, but do they use a lot of the resources from your office, or is there any sort of shared discussion with any of those groups?
Yeah, we work with Common Cause on legislative matters. We work with a group called the Center for Election Integrity out of the Twin Cities. They're a great group that has really drilled down on a lot of these issues. So yeah, we work with a bunch of nonprofit advocacy groups all the time, either on legislation or to provide them information, or sometimes they're in the middle of doing a report and they make data requests of us, and so we release a lot of public data for them, and we'll help them put it in tables and things like that. So yeah, we
And
do.
then this is just a bizarre off the wall thing I was thinking of. So somebody can just go file and say, I'm gonna run for such and such an office and pay the fee. I'm thinking specifically of a person who has a lot of emails, Loner Blue, who is also known as Scott somebody, but he changed his name, and it's just the most bizarre. I had 2, and the last one is just page after page of listing all kinds of nonprofit emails, the sheriffs, Wilder Foundation, everybody. And so somebody can just go register, is there any sort of vetting to see if that's
No, I mean,
legit or?
a candidate for office, I
Yeah.
mean, no, I mean, it's a First Amendment issue, right, and unless they're doing something illegal, wackiness and craziness and offbeatness and whatever, that's, so no, we certainly don't have any authority to vet. If they meet the basic requirements of running for office, age and citizenship and all the rest, then,
Little Oli, who runs every year.
that's
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
that's right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Isn't there somebody that's in state prison, in Minnesota, Stillwater Prison that's running? that
Yes,
runs
we have
every
had
year?
prisoners before who have
Mhm.
run, yes, absolutely, yeah. Go ahead.
So I think a lot of us are pretty sensitive to anything that even looks a little bit like a voter purge, given the news that's coming out of a lot of the states, especially down in the south. And I had a friend who posted today on Facebook that she voted in our primary election, and then, there are these like viral messages going around telling people to check their registration. And she checked her registration today, and it said that she wasn't registered.
Really?
Yeah, so I'm wondering if there are like any normal reasons that someone could potentially lose their registration, or what your suggestion would be
The only thing I can possibly think of, I would urge your friend to check with her county or city, depending on where she lives, just to figure out, it might be human error, it might be, has she moved?
I don't know.
Okay, that would be the only thing, if she moved between the primary in August and now, and they'd say you have to re-register. Just for the record, let me say, we do not purge in Minnesota. You've heard about the vote purging. Ohio, there was a US Supreme Court case this last term that unfortunately said that what Ohio was doing, its purging, was A-OK under the Voting Rights Act, which is unfortunate, but we don't do that. So the most that we do in Minnesota is move, like if someone moves, that's a good example, we move them to what's called inactive status, which is not purging, you're not off, you're not banished, you're not off the island, you're just on inactive status, and it's super easy. All you do to get on inactive status is say, hey, I'm here, I moved, or hey, it's me, you might have missed me, or something like that. And remember, we have same-day voter registration. So if, let's say it's a human error, just a mistake, I don't know what they do in Ohio, or New York, and Texas, and California, but in Minnesota, I know what you do.
SOL in those states.
I think you may be, but in Minnesota, you just show up and say, no, I'm here, I'm just gonna re-register here, or whatever. And I always say, when it comes to registration, you know, again, speaking of good laws, there are two major things that you need to show when you register to vote in Minnesota. You need to somehow show that you are who you say you are, and that you live where you say you live, those two things. But Minnesota law is very generous and very forgiving about what you can use to show those two things. Now, some people have a driver's license, great. Some people have another kind of ID, great. But some don't. Maybe for some it's a utility bill. Maybe for some it's a veteran's ID card. Maybe for some it's having a neighbor vouch for you. We're one of the 8 or 9 states that have vouching, which is a huge, huge innovation. You know, this is personal for me. My parents, in 1998, downsized from the house I grew up in, moved into a condo, and they did it in October. They did not even have a utility bill. So my dad could not have voted in the 1998 gubernatorial election had he not had someone vouch for him. I remember him talking about it, how he was gonna use the next door neighbor and all the rest, who he happened to know. And so that's great. That's a great convenience that we have. So we're lucky that way. So I would say that your friend should just check. It could be just a human error, but if everything goes wrong, she can just show up at the polling place on election day. Yeah.
Dakota County went to the poll pads for
Yes.
the primary, which, you know, change is hard for, you know, I mean,
Yep.
and it was fabulous. It was the most.
People like them.
Do you know how many counties are using those?
Yeah, so I don't know the exact number, but the question was about the poll pads, or the e-poll books as they're called. And by the way, there's less there than meets the eye. They don't talk to each other in real time, they're not networked that way. That would be more of a security risk. That's not it. All it is the electronic equivalent of the old rosters. The rosters are just the big, on the computer paper, the big, you know, you go in and you sign your name on the line, and they have to find your record and flip it over, and all that's called a roster. All it is an electronic version of that.
Yeah.
It's quicker, it's more efficient, people like them, election judges like them, of any age, all ages,
Yeah.
and it's worked out well. How many counties? Hard to say. I would say, I'm guessing around 10 of the 87 counties.
Okay.
Yeah.
And hopefully the success in those.
Definitely.
I mean, have you gotten feedback
Oh,
from
we've
those?
gotten great feedback. People really like them.
My only
Yeah.
comment about them would be that, and this is, I brought this up, we did a post, I was a head judge, and we did a post-mortem of the primary about anything that we need to talk about before the general. And the only thing is that little sleeve, which has nothing to do with the Secretary of State, it's a county thing. I mean,
Yeah.
it's the little plastic shelf that goes on the back of the poll pad for when people are registering. And it says on there, it's got silk screened on there, place ID here. And so it's
Interesting.
very, like, all day on primary day, people were digging in their pocket for their ID.
Interesting.
And I was working with a person from a different political party who I was a little bit leery of working with. And she was I was impressed with her. I was leery of working with her because I felt like she was gonna be one that would be like, oh, you know, I'm all for the voter ID, you know, showing an ID. She's like, it's the law, you know, and all the people were coming in saying, I think we should have to show that, or not all of them. A couple grumpy old people were saying that they wanted to show the ID. And she was like, this is the law, and if you wanna change the law, you talk to your legislator or whatever, so.
Yeah, that's the right answer.
So yes, it was. I was very impressed with her. I was like,
That's good.
that's awesome. But anyway, I couldn't figure out why people kept digging for their ID, cause
And it
and
was
I went and
that
looked at the
language.
sign, and the sign said if you needed to register to vote, that was on the front door when they came in, I think it it caught their eye, something about you need an ID. So I moved that sign partway through the day, because I'm like, okay, that is obviously catching people's eye. Well, it still kept going on, and finally I pulled, I looked at and I was like, okay, that's why. And I'm like, we need to take that off there, because really that's only, most of the time, if we were registering someone, we took their driver's license and put it on there and then it scans it, which was the slickest thing ever, to
Yeah.
type all that in.
I was
But-
really impressed because part of our training was that if people walk up and they have IDs out, to tell them that they could put it away so other people in line
Yes.
wouldn't think they needed an ID to
And then
walk
everyone's
off, and I was
shuffling.
so glad to hear that.
Right,
So,
yes, that was our
good.
training too, but
Yeah.
by that saying it on there, and our city clerk said, oh, I wonder if we can try to take that off, but I don't
Interesting.
think you can see, it was,
No.
it's
Right on
printed
the
on there,
device, yeah.
Unless we use some
Thank you for
fingernail
that.
polish
I hadn't
remover or
heard that
something.
before.
That's what duct
Duct
tape
tape.
is for.
I just have time for maybe one or two more. I have to leave a little bit earlier than I had hoped. Go ahead.
I wonder about ranked choice voting.
Yeah.
What does it take to get that, and why isn't everybody going, yeah, let's do it?
Right. So, interesting you say, what does it take? So, as some of you know, there are two cities right now that have it, Minneapolis and St. Paul. St. Louis Park just adopted it for next year's mayoral and city council 2019, and the city of Rochester is strongly considering it right now as well. So, I think it's a really interesting, noble experiment. It's limited right now just to municipal races, just to city council or mayor in those cities, and it will be for the foreseeable future. I'm not ready to say, hey, we should elect all offices up and down the ballot, but it's an interesting experiment. As to the way that cities get to adopt it, I have strong feelings about that. We have this weird rule in Minnesota where if you're one kind of city, which tends to be the bigger cities, you have total independence to either adopt it by a vote of the people or by city council. If you're another kind of city, mostly the smaller cities, you don't have that power. In fact, you gotta come begging the legislature for a specific bill to allow you, your specific city, to do it, which is a huge bottleneck. It prevents a lot of cities who want to do it from doing it, because it's very cumbersome, it's very complicated. So I have long been a proponent, when I was in the legislature and now, busting that process open and making it more fair so that all cities, regardless of type, can choose to experiment it. And look, there may be cities that try it and hate it. That's fine, they can ditch it. But if they try it and love it, they should be able to keep it, I think. And we should put all cities on an even playing field. So we'll see, we could have 4 cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Rochester, and St. Louis Park, and then it may grow from there. We'll see. People are comfortable with it, and some of its promised advantages bear out over time, then I think there will be a lot more interest.
So St. Louis Park has enough population or whatever it is in their city charter or whatever it is to be on the
Yes.
same level as Minneapolis and St.
Yes.
Paul and Rochester.
Exactly. Exactly.
Interesting. Is that
Yeah.
is that why cities can't pass their own plastic bag ordinance and whatever, is because?
I'm not sure about
is
that issue. I'm not sure about that. It depends on whether they're a so-called charter city or whether they're a statutory city. Not all cities have a city charter, and if you don't have a city charter, then you default to being a city where your city rules are basically in state statute, unless you have your own charter, which is basically a mini constitution for the city. So that's the way it's divided. It doesn't make any sense to me for something like this.
No.
It's not very fair.
No.
So that's my view on
Just
that.
on state level,
yes.
you're just watching now the cities, how it works.
Yeah.
But what would you take to
Oh,
take it to the state level?
The question is, what would it take to take it to the state level?
Yeah.
That would be more complicated. It would take legislation. Some have argued it would take a constitutional amendment, but it would take some major change to allow it for statewide elections, for sure. And it would take federal action, congressional action, to allow it for any federal elections, U.S. House or U.S. Senate or President. So that would be beyond our scope here in the state. So let me just say this. If any of you have other stuff, thoughts, impressions, pushback, feedback, whatever, I hope, and you think about it tonight or tomorrow or next week or next month or whatever, I hope you'll reach out to me. I really enjoy it. I thrive on it. If you have something like that, even criticism, my email is just the same as most state employees. It's steve.simon@state.mn.us. You can Google it. It's out there. There's no filter. There's no gatekeeper. There is no nothing. It just goes right to me. And I just say, hey, I was there in Rosemont at the library, but I didn't have a chance to say this or ask that or push you back on this or whatever. let me know about that. And in 27 days, remember to be a voter, right? Stakes are high. If nothing else, we can't have Wisconsin beat us.
No.
We gotta stay number one just for that reason alone.
Right.
Exactly.
So,
Thank you for your,
All right.
your-
Can I just?
of course.
Well, thank you,
Thank
Steve.
you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Before we finish, I want to get a selfie. We
Okay,
gotta
should
do
we
the
stand
group
up?
selfie
No,
here.
you're gonna stand up on the chair.
I'm gonna stand up on the chair and
I'm
do a
really
selfie.
bossy,
Okay.
sorry. Okay, you're gonna stand on the chair.
And then I'm gonna get everybody else.
Okay, are we gonna
Ready?
stand? Are we gonna stand and squish?
No,
or
we're
can you
good.
see us?
We're good.
I can see
Oh,
y'all
that's
now.
good.
Alright.
But my head is so
Yay,
big.
say Gorgonzola.
All right, there we go.
All
Thank you, everyone.
Yay!
All right, thanks for coming. And if you want to